Forget everything you imagine about dating. Forget the candlelight dinner. Forget the proposal on one knee. Forget hooking up and the we're just getting to know each other phase. Because 2,000 years ago, in the land where the Bible was written, a man could marry a woman without ever having heard her voice, without ever having touched her hand, without ever having been alone with her for a single second. And most shocking of all, she could be promised to him before she even learned how to walk. Does it sound absurd? Does it sound impossible? Does it even sound inhuman by our standards? Perhaps. But before you judge, understand one thing: the system worked. And it worked so well that entire civilizations were built upon it. Empires were born, royal lineages were established, and the very genealogy of Jesus Christ, yes, the Messiah, was determined by this exact model of dating that would seem completely alien to us today. So how did a young man 2,000 years ago win a wife? What did he do? What did he feel? Did he even have the right to feel anything? And the women, did they have any kind of choice, or were they treated like merchandise at a cattle fair? The answer is much more complex, much more surprising, and much more human than anything you've ever heard on the subject. First, let's destroy a myth that contaminates practically every conversation about marriage in antiquity. The myth is this: that women had no voice at all, that they were the property of their fathers, and that marriage was a cold transaction where the groom basically bought a wife, like someone buying a goat at the market. This isn't totally false, but it's also far from being totally true. And the difference between the myth and the reality lies in the details, and the details are fascinating. Let's start at the beginning, literally at the beginning. A girl is born into a Hebrew family around the year 30 BC. What happens to her in the first years of life? She is breastfed until the age of 3. That's right, 3 years old, double or triple what we do today. The mother carries this child tied to her body with linen bands while she works grinding grain, baking bread in the tabon, that round clay oven that sat on the ground, and fetching water from the village spring before the sun rises. This girl does not go to school, not because no one cares about her, but because the concept of school as we know it simply didn't exist for girls. Her education happens at home. She learns by watching. She learns to spin wool with a wooden spindle before the age of 6. She learns to separate the wheat from the chaff. She learns to identify medicinal herbs in the field. And this part is crucial. She learns the laws and traditions of Israel by listening to her father recite the Torah at meals and on the Sabbath. And here enters a detail that completely changes the mental image you have of these girls. The Talmud, the compilation of Jewish oral traditions, records heated debates between rabbis about the correct age for a father to arrange a marriage for his daughter. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, for example, argued that a girl should be promised only when she was mature enough to say, "I want to marry so-and-so," not just anyone the father chose. She needed to point and say the name. Think about what that means. We are talking about a culture from 2,000 years ago in the Middle East, where supposedly women had no voice, and there are legal records documented of rabbis demanding that the girl express her preference. The Talmud, Tractate Kiddushin 41a, states textually that it is forbidden for a man to give his daughter in marriage while she is a minor, and that he must wait until she grows up and says, "I want so-and-so." Is that surprising? It should be, because it completely destroys the simplistic caricature people have made of this period. But, and here is the twist, that was the ideal. The reality on the ground, in the day-to-day life of the villages of Galilee and Judea, was much more complicated, because between what the rabbis taught and what the fathers actually did, there was a huge abyss. And that abyss was filled by one single thing: money. The mohar. This word will appear several times throughout this video, so burn it into your mind. Mohar. It is the value that the groom, or more precisely the groom's family, paid to the bride's family to seal the marriage commitment. And when I say value, I'm talking about concrete things: silver, sheep, goats, land, manual labor. Genesis mentions the mohar directly. Exodus establishes that a man who seduced a virgin had to pay the mohar of virgins to her father. Now, how much did a bride cost? It depends on the era, the region, and the family's status. But to give you an idea, in the Second Temple period, which is exactly the time of Jesus, the standard mohar for a virgin was 200 denarii. A denarius was the wage for a full day of manual labor. Matthew 22 confirms this value when Jesus tells the parable of the workers in the vineyard. So, do the math. 200 days of work, almost 7 months of full salary, without spending a single cent on food, clothing, or housing. 7 months of net income. Translating to our reality, if a worker earns $3,000 a month, the mohar would be something around $21,000. Does that seem like a manageable amount? Maybe for us. But for a young shepherd from a village of 200 people in first-century Galilee, that amount was a mountain. And that is why many men only married after the age of 30, not because they wanted to wait, but because they simply didn't have the money. If you think that was difficult, wait until you hear the case of Jacob. Genesis 29 tells one of the most dramatic dating stories in the entire Bible. Jacob sees Rachel for the first time by a well. The text says she was lovely in form and beautiful, beautiful in body and face. And what does Jacob do? He weeps. Genesis says he kissed Rachel and lifted up his voice and wept. A grown man, strong enough to roll away a stone by himself that usually required several shepherds, cried upon seeing the woman he wanted. But Jacob had no money, he had no flock, he had nothing. He had fled his father's house with only the clothes on his back. So, what does he do? He goes to Laban, Rachel's father, and offers the only thing he possesses, his own body. 7 years of labor, 7 years of sweat, of scorching sun, of nights sleeping in the open guarding sheep against lions and bears in exchange for a woman. The text of Genesis says something so beautiful that I need to read it slowly. So Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. A few days. 7 years seemed like a few days. This is not a commercial transaction. This is visceral, deep love, the kind of feeling that makes 7 years of slave labor feel like a weekend. And then comes the blow. Laban deceives Jacob. On the wedding night, in the darkness of the tent, with the veil covering the bride's face, Laban swaps Rachel for Leah, the older sister. Jacob only finds out the next morning. 7 years of work, and he wakes up next to the wrong woman. If you think modern soap operas invented betrayal and drama, the Bible already had all of it 4,000 years ago. But Jacob's story, as dramatic as it is, was not the standard. It is the exception that confirms the rule. The rule was much more organized, almost surgically planned, and the process worked in very clear stages that I will break down now. Step 1, the selection. Who chose the spouse? In the vast majority of cases, the parents, specifically the father. He observed the families of the village, evaluated lineage, reputation, health, financial situation, and mainly tribal purity. Marrying within the same tribe was not just a preference, it was almost a commandment. Numbers 36 tells the case of the daughters of Zelophehad, where God explicitly determines that they must marry within their father's tribe so that the land inheritance would not pass from one tribe to another. So, when a Hebrew father looked at the horizon and thought about his daughter's future, he wasn't thinking about love, emotional compatibility, or physical attraction. He was thinking about land, about inheritance, about continuity, about which tribe that land would belong to 3 generations from now. If this seems cool to you, comment now, different world. Because it was. It was a world completely different from ours, with completely different rules, completely different priorities, and a completely different definition of love. Step 2. The negotiation. Once the father identified a suitable family, a process began that looked more like international diplomacy than a marriage proposal. And here enters a figure that few people know about, the Shad Khan, the intermediary, the matchmaker. In wealthier families, the Shad Khan was almost a profession. This man, and it was almost always a man, knew the families of the region, knew who had daughters of marriageable age, who had sons capable of paying the mohar, and functioned as a marriage broker. His job was to introduce the two sides, negotiate terms, prevent conflicts, and ensure that no one was publicly humiliated. Because in a village of 200 or 300 people, a marriage negotiation that went wrong could create an enmity between families that would last for generations. But in most ordinary families, the father did this work himself. He would go to the young woman's family home, sit down, accept a bowl of goat's milk or a piece of bread with olive oil and start talking. And this conversation could last for days, weeks, months, because it wasn't just about saying, "I want your daughter for my son." It was about aligning expectations regarding the mohar, regarding the dowry, which is different from the mohar, and I'll explain that in a moment, regarding where the couple would live, regarding inheritance rights, and regarding future responsibilities. Now, pay attention to this difference because almost everyone gets it confused. Mohar and dowry are not the same thing. Mohar is what the groom's family pays to the bride's family. The dowry, in Hebrew, nedunya, is what the bride's family gives to the bride for her to take into the marriage. They are opposite directions of payment. The dowry could include clothes, jewelry, household utensils, money, and in wealthy families, even land and slaves. And here is a crucial detail that almost no one mentions. The dowry belonged to the woman, not to the husband. If the marriage ended, yes, divorce existed, Deuteronomy 24:1 speaks of it, the woman had the legal right to take her dowry with her. It was her financial security, her life insurance in a world where a woman alone without resources simply did not survive. So, when you combine the mohar plus the dowry, marriage becomes a network of financial exchanges involving two entire families, sometimes 3 generations, and moving a significant amount of wealth. A marriage in antiquity was simultaneously a family alliance, an economic treaty, and, yes, sometimes a love story. But what about love? Where does it fit into this whole equation? That is the question you've been asking since the beginning of the video, and the answer goes against everything the modern world has taught you. In the ancient world, love was not the reason for marriage. Love was the result of marriage. You didn't get married because you loved. You loved because you got married. Does it seem strange? Does it even seem sad? Perhaps to our eyes, but think about this. In our model, 2 people fall in love. They get married, and often the love cools over time. The divorce rate in the Western world is above 40%. In the ancient model, 2 people marry without love, and often love grows over time. Isaac and Rebekah, Genesis. The text says that Isaac took Rebekah and she became his wife, and he loved her. Notice the order. First he married, then he loved. And it wasn't a weak love. Proverbs 5:18-19 says to the husband, "Rejoice in the wife of your youth, a loving doe, a graceful deer. May her breasts satisfy you always. May you ever be intoxicated with her love." This text is 3,000 years old, and it speaks of desire, of passion, of intoxication within marriage. The Song of Solomon, an entire book of the Bible, is basically erotic poetry between husband and wife. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is more delightful than wine. Song of Solomon 1:2. This is not a commercial transaction. This is fire. And this fire existed within a system that, viewed from the outside, seemed purely pragmatic. Now comes the part that no one talks about. The period between the commitment and the wedding. The erusin, the betrothal. And if you think an engagement today is serious, you have no idea what a betrothal was 2,000 years ago. The erusin was not a promise. It wasn't a, "we're engaged." It was a legal contract, as binding as the marriage itself. From the moment the erusin was sealed, usually with the delivery of an object of value, like a coin or ring, in front of two witnesses, the woman was considered the man's legal wife, even without having moved into his house, even without having consummated the marriage. If she became involved with another man during the erusin, she was considered an adulteress. If the groom died during the erusin, she was considered a widow. Do you know why this is so important? Because it is exactly what happened with Mary and Joseph. Matthew says that Mary was betrothed to Joseph. The Greek word is mnesteuthesis, which means legally committed, when she was found to be pregnant. Joseph, being righteous, wanted to leave her secretly. Why secretly? Because the normal legal process would be to expose her publicly as an adulteress. The erusin was so serious that breaking it required a formal divorce, not a cancellation, a divorce. If this revelation impressed you, leave a like now so this video reaches more people who need to understand this context. And how long did this period between the erusin and the wedding itself last? Usually 1 year, 12 full months. And those 12 months were perhaps the strangest, most tense, and most interesting period of the whole process. The groom would return to his father's house. The bride would stay at her father's house. And for 12 months, they lived in separate towns or neighborhoods, preparing for life together, but without living together. The groom spent that year building, literally building. He would add a room to his father's house or build a new house adjacent to the family complex. In John 14:2, Jesus uses exactly this image. "In my Father's house are many rooms. I am going there to prepare a place for you." The disciples understood perfectly. Jesus was using the language of a groom preparing a house to go and get his bride. Meanwhile, the bride spent the year gathering her trousseau, learning recipes from her mother-in-law. Yes, the mother-in-law was already a central figure 2,000 years ago. And waiting.
Is anyone there?
Waiting for a moment she didn't know when would come. Because here is the most cinematic detail of the whole process. The groom came to fetch the bride when his father decided the room was ready. The groom didn't choose the day. The father chose. And the groom could be sent to fetch the bride at any moment, in the morning, in the afternoon, or in the middle of the night. Imagine the scene. It is the middle of the night. The entire village is sleeping. Suddenly, a cry cuts through the silence. The groom is coming. The groom is coming. Torches are lit. The sound of a shofar, the ram's horn trumpet, echoes through the narrow stone streets. The groom appears with his friends carrying torches, singing, beating drums, and the bride needs to be ready, dressed, prepared, with oil in her lamp. If this reminds you of something, it should. Matthew 25, the parable of the 10 virgins. 5 were ready with oil in their lamps. 5 were without oil. When the groom arrived at midnight, the 5 who were prepared went into the feast. The 5 without oil were left outside. Jesus didn't invent this story out of thin air. He described something that every person in his audience had already seen happen. It was a real wedding. That was how it worked. And the wedding procession that followed was something you wouldn't forget if you saw it once in your life. The groom, dressed like a king, literally the Talmud says the groom was treated like a king during the wedding week, walked through the streets with the bride covered by a veil so thick that no one could see her face. Torches lit the way, musicians played, the women of the village danced and sang, and the whole community joined the procession because a wedding was not a private matter. It was the most important event in community life. It was more important than any holiday, any religious feast, any visit from an authority. The Talmud says that even the study of the Torah, could be interrupted to participate in a wedding procession. If you know the value that the Jews placed on the study of the scriptures, you understand the weight of that statement. Nothing, absolutely nothing, was more sacred than celebrating the union of a new couple. But before getting to that celebration, there was a stage that was, perhaps, the strangest of all to our modern eyes: the verification of virginity. Deuteronomy 22:13-21 describes a scenario that would make anyone in the 21st century gasp. If a man married a woman and then claimed she was not a virgin, the girl's parents had to present to the elders of the city the proofs of virginity. Betulim in Hebrew. What were these proofs? The sheet from the wedding night, stained with blood. If the parents could present the sheet, the husband was punished with a fine of 100 shekels of silver, double the standard mohar, and he lost the right to divorce her for the rest of his life. If the parents could not present proof, the woman could be stoned to death at the door of her father's house. You read that right. Stoned to death. Now, before you go into total shock, two important points. First, there are very few historical records of this penalty actually being carried out. The rabbis of the Talmud created so many procedural requirements for an execution by stoning that, in practice, it became almost impossible to apply. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah even said that a court that executed one person every 70 years was considered destructive. Second, many scholars believe that this law functioned more as a protective shield for the woman than as a threat. Because the practical effect was this: a husband would think twice before falsely accusing his wife, since he could end up paying 100 shekels and losing the right to divorce forever. And speaking of divorce, because yes, divorce existed and was much more common than you imagine, the process was surprisingly simple for the man and devastatingly difficult for the woman. Deuteronomy 24:1 says that if a man found in his wife ervat davar, translated as something indecent or something shameful, he could write a bill of divorce, the get, put it in her hand, and send her away from his house. Done. Marriage over. But what did something indecent mean? This ambiguity generated one of the most famous debates in Jewish history. In the time of Jesus, two rabbinical schools diverged radically. The school of Shammai said that something indecent meant exclusively sexual infidelity. Only betrayal justified divorce. The school of Hillel was much more liberal. It said that even burning dinner was a valid reason for a man to divorce. Rabbi Akiva went even further. He said that if the husband found a more beautiful woman, that was reason enough. And when the Pharisees tried to test Jesus with this exact question, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? In Matthew 19:3, they were throwing Jesus into the middle of this debate between Shammai and Hillel. Jesus' answer was brilliant and devastating. He went back to the beginning, to Genesis, and said that God created man and woman to be one flesh, and that what God has joined together, man must not separate. He didn't choose a side between Shammai and Hillel. He surpassed them both. But here is something few realize. The woman did not have the right to ask for a divorce, at least not in the original biblical law. She could appeal to a court to force the husband to grant the get in extreme cases. If he had a repulsive disease, if he changed professions to something degrading like a leather tanner, or if he refused to fulfill his conjugal duty. Yes, the conjugal duty was a legal right of the woman. Exodus lists 3 obligations of the husband: food, clothing, and conjugal rights. If he failed in any of these 3, she could go free. And the frequency of conjugal rights was determined by the Talmud, based on the husband's profession. And without occupation, every day, laborers twice a week, donkey drivers once a week, camel drivers once every 30 days, sailors once every 6 months. This is in Tractate Ketubot 61b. It's not an invention, it is documented law. If that surprised you as much as it surprised me while researching, comment, I didn't know that. Now let's talk about something that will completely change the way you view relationships in the Bible, the role of the look. Because in a society where men and women didn't mix freely, where there was no Instagram, no bars, no college parties, how did attraction happen? How did a young man even know he found a girl beautiful? The answer lies in very specific moments, almost surgically controlled by society, where men and women could see each other. And the most important of them was the well. The well was the Tinder of the ancient world, and I'm not exaggerating. Think about the logistics. In a village without running water, someone needs to go to the well to fetch water every day. And who went? The young women. Genesis shows Abraham's servant strategically positioned by the well at the time of evening, the time when women go out to draw water. He wasn't there by chance. He knew that was the time and place where he would find candidates. Jacob finds Rachel at the well. Moses finds Zipporah at the well. Abraham's servant finds Rebekah at the well. 3 of the most important marriages in the Bible start in the same place. Coincidence? No. A social system functioning exactly as planned. The well was the only public space where a man could observe a woman working, evaluate her strength, her disposition, her appearance, her character, all without breaking any social rules. A girl who offered to give water to camels, as Rebekah did, demonstrated generosity, physical strength, and initiative. A girl who protected her father's sheep against aggressive shepherds, as Zipporah did, demonstrated courage. The well was not just a source of water, it was an audition stage for marriage. But the well wasn't the only moment. There was another, once a year, which was basically the biggest matchmaking event in Israel. And it is so surprising that when I first read it, I thought it was an invention. The Talmud, Tractate Tanit 26b, describes that on the 15th day of the month of Av, Tu B'Av, and on the Day of Atonement, the daughters of Jerusalem would go out dressed in white and dance in the vineyards. And they would say to the young men watching them, "Young man, lift up your eyes and see what you choose for yourself. Do not set your eyes on beauty, set your eyes on family." Read that again. The women told the men what to look at. The women took the initiative. The women danced, the men observed and chose, but the women controlled the narrative. Don't look at my beauty, look at my family. That is sophisticated, that is strategic, and that was happening 2,000 years ago. And there is an even more impressive detail. The Talmud says they all wore borrowed white clothes, so that no girl who didn't have nice clothes would be shamed. The richest girl in Jerusalem wore the same simple white dress as the poorest. The goal was to level the playing field, to eliminate class difference at least in that moment, so that the young man would choose the woman, not the clothes. This is not a primitive people. This is sophisticated social engineering, and it was happening while most of the world was still living in caves or mud huts. But if the well and Tu B'Av were the allowed moments of eye contact, what happened between those moments? How did a young man deal with desire, with attraction, with the urge to be near someone in a society that prohibited practically any form of physical contact before marriage? And more importantly, what happened when the rules were broken? Because the rules were broken, and the consequences could be terrible or surprisingly merciful. The answer lies in one of the most misunderstood stories in the entire Bible, Judah and Tamar. Genesis 38. If you've never read this chapter carefully, prepare yourself, because it's a story Hollywood would never have the courage to film. And yet it's there, in the middle of the scriptures, uncensored, unfiltered, without apologies. Judah, son of Jacob, grandson of Abraham, arranges a marriage for his firstborn, with a woman named Tamar. Dies. By the law of the Levirate, which we will explore in detail shortly, the second son, Onan, was supposed to marry Tamar to provide offspring for his dead brother. Onan refuses in a way the text describes with a frankness that still shocks translators. He also dies. Judah promises Tamar that when his third son, Shelah, grew up, she would marry him. But Judah doesn't keep the promise. Years pass, Shelah grows up, and Judah simply ignores Tamar. She is stuck in a devastating social limbo. She isn't married, she isn't a free widow, she can't seek another husband, because technically she is still promised to Shelah. She is a woman without status, without a future, without children, without protection. And what does Tamar do? She takes off her widow's clothes, covers herself with a veil, sits by the roadside at Enaim, and waits for Judah to pass by. Judah sees her. He doesn't recognize her because of the veil. He thinks she is a cult prostitute. He negotiates the price, a young goat from the flock. She asks for guarantees: his seal, his cord, and his staff. The three objects that identified a man as surely as a fingerprint identifies you today. They lie together. She becomes pregnant. And when Judah finds out 3 months later that his daughter-in-law is pregnant, his reaction is immediate and brutal. Bring her out and have her burned to death. Burn her, not stone her, burn her. An even more severe penalty, reserved for cases of immorality within priestly families. And it is at that moment that Tamar plays her final card. She sends the objects, the seal, the cord, the staff, with a simple message: I am pregnant by the man who owns these. Judah looks at the objects. He recognizes each one, and he says a sentence that has echoed for 3,000 years. She is more righteous than I. Tzadka mimeni. 6 syllables in Hebrew that flip the entire game. The man who was going to burn her alive recognizes that she is more righteous than he is. She is more righteous because he broke the promise. He failed in the duty of the Levirate. He left her trapped in a legal void with no way out, and she, using the only tools she had, her body, her intelligence, her courage, forced justice to happen. And do you know what's most impressive? Tamar is not punished. She is not condemned. She is not marginalized. She appears in the genealogy of Jesus Christ in Matthew 1:3. The woman who dressed as a prostitute to get pregnant by her father-in-law is in the direct lineage of the Messiah. If that doesn't destroy your idea that the Bible is a book of simplistic moralism, nothing will. But why am I telling this story in a video about dating and marriage? Because Tamar reveals something crucial about how the ancient world dealt with rules and their exceptions. The rules were rigid, yes. Virginity mattered, yes. Contact between men and women was controlled, yes. But when the rules created injustice, when the system failed, when a man like Judah broke his word and left a woman trapped in a limbo with no way out, tradition itself recognized that the woman had the right to act, even if she acted in ways that, under normal circumstances, would be condemnable. Justice was greater than the rule, and this principle appears repeatedly in ancient texts. And this leads us directly to the Levirate, one of the strangest and most important practices of the ancient world. Deuteronomy 25:5-10. If a man died without children, his brother was obligated to marry the widow and father a son who would carry the dead man's name. The first son of this second marriage was not considered the son of the living brother. He was legally the son of the dead man. He inherited his name, his land, his portion in the family. To our eyes, this is bizarre. To ancient eyes, it was the most logical thing in the world. Because in a system where land was life, where inheritance passed from father to son, where a man's name was his immortality, dying without children was the greatest possible tragedy. It wasn't just sad. It was an existential erasure. Your name disappeared. Your portion of land was absorbed by others. Your lineage died. It was as if you had never existed. The Levirate prevented this. It was an insurance system against erasure. And the widow was not a passive victim in this process. If the brother-in-law refused to fulfill the duty of the Levirate, she had the right to take him to the city gate, the public court, and perform a ceremony called chalitza. She would take the sandal off his foot, spit on the ground before him, the text says before him, some interpret in his face, and declare publicly, "This is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line." And from then on, his family was known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled, permanent public humiliation. The family name was stained for generations. This is female power encoded in religious law 3,000 years ago. And the story of Ruth, the entire book of Ruth, is basically a narrative about the Levirate in action. Ruth, a Moabite, a widow, a foreigner, without resources, without children, follows her mother-in-law Naomi back to Bethlehem. And Naomi, who is perhaps the greatest matrimonial strategist in the entire Bible, instructs Ruth to do something extraordinary. She tells Ruth to wash, perfume herself, put on her best clothes, go to the threshing floor where Boaz would be working, wait for him to finish eating, drinking, and lie down, and then approach, uncover his feet, and lie down there. "He will tell you what to do," Naomi says. His feet, lying at his feet. Now, commentators have debated for centuries whether feet here is literal or a euphemism. The Hebrew word margelot can mean both feet and the lower region of the body in general. But regardless of the exact interpretation, what Ruth does that night on the threshing floor is, by the standards of that society, an act of almost unthinkable courage. A single woman going to a single man in the middle of the night, lying down beside him and saying, as Ruth says in Ruth 3:9, "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer." Spread your garment. In Hebrew, kanaf, which means wing, edge of the cloak, and was the expression used for a marriage proposal. Ruth is proposing marriage to Boaz. The woman is proposing to the man. And not indirectly, not through her father, not through intermediaries, face to face, in the middle of the night, on the threshing floor, alone, and Boaz's response, "The Lord bless you, my daughter. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor." Boaz is not offended. He is not shocked. He doesn't call her indecent. He calls her blessed. And he recognizes her loyalty, first to her mother-in-law, now to the duty of the Levirate and the preservation of her dead husband's family. And here is the legal complication. Boaz was not the closest guardian redeemer. There was another man with priority rights, and Boaz, being a righteous man, doesn't skip the line. He goes to the city gate the next day, gathers 10 elders, confronts the other relative, and settles the matter publicly. The other relative gives up the right when he discovers that marrying Ruth would mean the land he bought would not belong to his children, but to the lineage of Ruth's dead husband. Boaz takes over. He marries Ruth, and their son, Obed, becomes the grandfather of King David and an ancestor of Jesus. The Moabite woman, who lay at a man's feet on the threshing floor, is in the direct lineage of the Messiah. Again, just like Tamar, women who broke the rules or bent them to the limit so that justice would prevail. They all ended up in the genealogy of Christ. But now, let's change direction completely, because until now, I've spoken about families, negotiations, contracts, the Levirate, but I haven't spoken about something that existed in the ancient world with a force that few modern preachers admit: sexuality outside of marriage. What happened when someone simply gave in to desire? Because people gave in. They always have. In every era, in every culture, in every religion, the rules said one thing, bodies said another, and the biblical world was no exception. Exodus 22:16-17 describes a scenario that scholars call the seduction of the virgin. If a man seduced a virgin who was not pledged to be married, he was obligated to pay the mohar and marry her. The father could refuse the marriage, but the man still had to pay the full value of the mohar. Notice, it's not stoning, it's not the death penalty, it's marriage or financial compensation. The system recognized that sexual attraction existed, that young people sometimes acted on impulse, and it created a mechanism to absorb these situations within the social structure instead of destroying the people involved. Now compare this with Deuteronomy 22:28-29, a text that generates intense debate to this day. If a man forced a virgin, the Hebrew word tapas can mean anything from grabbing to violating. He was obligated to marry her and pay 50 shekels to the father, and he could never divorce her. To us, forcing a woman to marry her aggressor is monstrous. But in the context of the ancient world, the logic, as disturbing as it may be, was different. A woman who lost her virginity outside of marriage, whether by consent or by violence, was considered socially destroyed. No other man would accept her as a wife. Without marriage, no economic protection. Without economic protection, misery or death. The law forced the aggressor to support her for the rest of his life without the possibility of discarding her. He lost the right to divorce forever. This means that while any other husband could divorce his wife for burning dinner, this husband could not divorce her for any reason, ever. The law turned the aggressor into the victim's economic prisoner. Was it a punishment disguised as protection? Was it protection disguised as punishment? It was probably both. And if the woman or her father did not want this marriage, the text in Exodus 22 gives the father the right to refuse. Many scholars read the two texts together. The obligation to marry existed, but the woman's family could reject it and still receive the compensation. It wasn't perfect. Nothing in a world without police, without a professional justice system, without shelters for vulnerable women. Nothing was perfect. But it was a system trying, within the brutal limits of antiquity, to create some safety net for the most vulnerable. And prostitution? It existed everywhere. The Old Testament mentions common prostitutes, the Zona, and cult prostitutes, the Kadesha, linked to Canaanite pagan temples. Rahab of Jericho was a Zona. Joshua 2:1 says this bluntly, and she also appears in the genealogy of Jesus. Matthew 1:5, the prostitute of Jericho is in the lineage of Christ. One more irregular woman, one more exception to the rule, one more proof that the God of the Bible never seemed particularly interested in an impeccable moral pedigree. But if prostitution was tolerated, or at least recognized as a reality, adultery was a completely different frontier. Leviticus is direct. If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, both the adulterer and the adulteress are to be put to death. Both, not just the woman, the man too. And here is a distinction that most people confuse. In the biblical world, adultery had a very precise technical definition. It wasn't just any sexual relationship outside of marriage. It was specifically a sexual relationship with a married or committed woman. A married man who slept with a single uncommitted woman did not commit adultery. He committed fornication, which was treated very differently, usually with mandatory marriage or financial compensation. But a married woman who slept with any man who was not her husband committed adultery, regardless of her partner's marital status. This seems like a double standard, and it was. But the logic behind it, again, was patrilineal. The adultery of a married woman threatened the certainty of paternity. Who was the father of the children? Whose was the inheritance? Whose was the land? In a society without DNA testing, the wife's sexual fidelity was the only guarantee that a man's son was truly his son. And for that reason, female adultery was treated as the most serious crime after murder. But how was this in practice? The most famous story is John 8. The woman caught in adultery, brought to Jesus by the Pharisees. Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say? Note first what is missing. Where is the man? The law said both should die. If she was caught in the act, the man was there too, and yet they only brought her. This already shows that the Pharisees were not interested in justice. They were setting a trap for Jesus. If he said stone her, he violated the Roman law that prohibited autonomous Jewish executions. If he said don't stone her, he contradicted Moses. Jesus' answer, let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her, is not just a nice phrase for a t-shirt. It is a legal bombshell, because according to Jewish law, the witnesses to the crime were supposed to be the first to execute the sentence. And if the witnesses were compromised, if they had participated in a setup, for example, the whole accusation collapsed. Jesus didn't abolish the law. He exposed the corruption of those who were using it as a weapon. And when everyone left one by one, from the oldest to the youngest, Jesus was left alone with the woman. Has no one condemned you? Then neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin. I do not condemn, but sin no more. Grace and truth, mercy and a moral standard, both at the same time without contradiction. This is perhaps the most revolutionary moment in the history of human relationships. The moment someone said, the person matters more than the rule. Restoration matters more than punishment. And this tension between rule and grace, between structure and compassion, between the system and the individual, is the beating heart of everything we've seen in this video so far, and is also the key to understanding the revolution that was to come. Because Jesus didn't just come to participate in this system, he came to transform it. And the way he treated women, the Samaritan woman at the well, Mary Magdalene, Martha and Mary, the woman with the issue of blood, was so radical, so outside the norm that his own disciples were shocked. But that is the next part of the story. And here we reach the point that changes everything. Because until now, we have walked through a world where marriage was a negotiation between families, where the woman was transferred from father to husband as part of an economic contract, where love could exist, but was never the starting point, a world where the rules were clear, rigid, and almost always favored men. And then appears an itinerant rabbi from Galilee who begins to do things that no one expected. John 4. Jesus is tired, sitting by Jacob's well in Samaria. It is noon. The sun is at its peak. A woman arrives to draw water, and Jesus does something that simultaneously violates three social norms. He speaks to her, a woman, a Samaritan, alone, without any intermediary, without any relative present, without any protocol reason to start this conversation. The disciples, when they return and see the scene, are astonished. The Greek text uses the word ithaumason. They were amazed, perplexed, almost stunned. But none of them dared to ask, "Why are you talking with her?" They knew something was happening that went beyond conventions. And what does Jesus do in this conversation? He discusses theology with her, deep theology, worship in spirit and truth, the nature of God, the identity of the Messiah. He reveals to her, to a Samaritan woman with 5 failed marriages and living with a man who was not her husband, something he had not yet openly said even to his closest disciples. I, the one speaking to you, I am he. The first person to whom Jesus explicitly declares himself to be the Messiah is a woman with a marital history that would exclude her from any respectable synagogue. This is no accident. This is a declaration of principle. And the woman, who has no name in the text, known only as the Samaritan, does something no apostle had done before her. She leaves her water jar and runs to the city preaching, "Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did." Could this be the Messiah? She becomes the first evangelist of the New Testament, and many Samaritans believed because of her testimony. From a woman with 5 marriages, living in an irregular situation in the 1st century, in a world where female testimony had no legal value. Now think of Mary and Martha in Bethany, Lucas 10. Jesus enters their house. Martha is serving, doing what every woman should do according to social protocol. Mary sits at Jesus' feet and listens to his teachings. To sit at the feet of was the technical expression for discipleship. Paul says he was instructed at the feet of Gamaliel. When Mary sits at Jesus' feet, she is assuming the position of a disciple, something reserved exclusively for men. And when Martha complains, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself?" Jesus doesn't say, "Mary, go help your sister." He says, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. It will not be taken away from her." This sentence has the weight of a judicial ruling. Jesus is saying that Mary's right to discipleship is inviolable. No social convention, no gender expectation, no domestic protocol can nullify this woman's right to learn. And that, in the first century, was as radical as if someone entered a mosque in Afghanistan today and said that girls have an inviolable right to education. And the woman with the issue of blood, Mark 5. 12 years of bleeding, 12 years ritually impure, 12 years without being able to touch anyone, without being able to be touched, without being able to enter the temple, without being able to participate in any religious feast, without being able to sit in a chair, without making it impure, without being able to sleep in a bed, without contaminating it. 12 years of total isolation. She spends everything she has on doctors. No one heals her. And she touches the edge of Jesus' cloak, in the middle of the crowd, without asking permission. According to the law of purity, she just made Jesus ritually impure. Any rabbi would be furious. But Jesus stops. In the middle of an emergency, he is on his way to resurrect Jairus' daughter. He stops and asks, "Who touched my clothes?" The disciples find the question absurd. You see the people crowding against you, and yet you can ask, "Who touched me?" But Jesus insists, because he doesn't want the healing to be a stolen secret. He wants her to come out of invisibility. And when she kneels, trembling with fear, and tells the whole truth, Jesus says, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Daughter. He calls her daughter. He reinstates her, publicly, before everyone. A woman whom the religious system treated as walking contamination, Jesus calls daughter and declares that her faith, not ritual purity, not social status, not the approval of priests, her faith was what saved her. And now, marriage. What did Jesus actually teach about marriage? Because here, he also surprises. Matthew 19. The Pharisees come to test him. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? It was the great debate of the time. The school of Shammai said divorce was only allowed for sexual infidelity. The school of Hillel said the husband could divorce for practically any reason, including burning the food. Rabbi Akiva went even further. If the husband found a more beautiful woman, he could divorce, and Jesus doesn't answer with casuistry. He goes to the root. Haven't you read that at the beginning, the Creator made them male and female, and said, "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh? So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." Notice what he does. He doesn't quote Deuteronomy 24, which regulates divorce. He quotes Genesis 1 and 2. He skips over all the Mosaic legislation and goes back to the original creation. And when the Pharisees ask, "Why then did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away?" Jesus answers, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. This is revolutionary." Jesus is saying that the legislation of easy divorce, which gave the man almost absolute power to discard his wife, was not God's original plan. It was a concession to human brutality, a temporary patch. And the reaction of the disciples reveals how radical this was. They say, if this is the situation between a husband and wife, it is better not to marry. If we can't get rid of our wives whenever we want, then it's better not to even get married. This sentence, spoken by Jesus' own disciples, reveals how corrupted the system was. Marriage was only attractive to men because they had an easy exit door. When Jesus closes that door, the disciples themselves hesitate. And there is one more thing Jesus does that no one before him did. He extends the definition of adultery. Matthew 5:28. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. In the old system, remember, adultery was defined in terms of property. A man committed adultery if he slept with another man's wife. The crime was against her husband, not against her. Jesus interiorizes the concept. He shifts it from the sphere of contract to the sphere of conscience. And in doing so, he equals the sexes in an unprecedented way. The man is now as responsible for his desires as the woman was responsible for her virginity. The millennial asymmetry begins to crack, and Paul, who is so often accused of misogyny, writes something in 1 Corinthians 7 that would be unimaginable for any rabbi of his time. Verse 4, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. In the same way, total reciprocity. The husband's body belongs to the wife as much as the wife's body belongs to the husband. In a world where the woman was property, Paul says that the man is also property of the wife. Sexual rights are mutual. Authority is shared. And in verse 3, the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. Before any instruction on submission, before any hierarchy, reciprocity. And Ephesians 5, the most misinterpreted text in the entire Bible about marriage. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. Everyone quotes this verse. Almost no one quotes what comes before, verse 21. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Submission is mutual before it is specific, and almost no one takes seriously what comes after. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, as Christ loved the church. And how did Christ love the church? By dying for her. Paul is saying to the husband, your model of leadership is a man who washed his disciples' feet and died on a cross. Your authority is exercised through sacrifice, not through control, through service, not through domination. This is not patriarchy. This is the demolition of patriarchy using the very language of patriarchy. And this is where everything connects. We began this video with the father negotiating 50 shekels for his daughter. We went through marriage contracts, virginity control, ceremonies at the gate, the terror of the mohar, the test of the bitter waters, the Levirate, Tamar dressed as a prostitute by the roadside, Ruth lying at Boaz's feet on the threshing floor, the woman caught in adultery, trembling before Jesus. And what we see when we look at all of this together is not a static world, it is a world in motion. A long arc that bends slowly, painfully, with setbacks and contradictions in the direction of dignity, in the direction of seeing the woman not as property, not as a bargaining chip, not as an incubator for heirs, but as a person, as a partner, as someone whose yes matters as much as the man's yes. 2,000 years ago, no one asked a 14-year-old girl if she wanted to marry that man. Today, you have the right to say no, to say yes, to choose when, with whom, and under what terms. This didn't fall from the sky. This was built brick by brick, century by century, story by story, by women like Tamar, like Ruth, like Abigail, like the Samaritan woman at the well. Women who looked at a system that treated them as objects and said, I am more than this. And if today you can fall in love with whomever you want, if you can look into someone's eyes and say, "I choose you," without needing your father to negotiate a price, thank these women, thank this ark, thank this story you have just heard. Because the story of dating in the Bible is not a story about ancient rules and strange customs. It is the story of how humanity learned, slowly, stumbling, with brutal errors and courageous corrections, that love is not a contract, that marriage is not a purchase, that one person is not the property of another person, and that the dignity of the person standing before you is more sacred than any tradition. If this video impressed you, click on the video appearing on your screen now. I guarantee it will surprise you even more.